Hello, I'm Michelle Leduc-Catlin. Welcome to episode 9 of season 1 of Trued Up, the podcast that invites you to be the change. Truth, beauty, goodness. What are you most drawn to? What gives you access to the divine? What could lift you right now? These three transcendentals hold the answers to the questions of life, the universe, and everything. That and 42. They're also starting points of inspiration. I used to be sourced mostly through beauty. I loved to sing and dance. I was a writer and a reader, a director and an actor. I produced home design shows and fashion segments for television. I was inspired by great art in all its forms. I could find inspiration in a plush armchair in the lounge of a grand hotel or with a walk through a cobblestone street in an old village. When my health deteriorated and my life became contained within the perimeter of my country home, I turned inward. I began to deeply explore spirituality. Why was this happening to me, or for me? How do we overcome obstacles and be our best selves? Goodness became my primary focus, making meaning out of suffering that seemed senseless, making a difference for myself as a source for others. With the COVID crisis, my attention turned to truth. I spent my days researching and writing, sharing information I didn't then realize was being intentionally withheld, exposing the truth, unleashing it with as much goodness as I could find. Beauty took a back seat until my inspiration dried up. I needed to find my source again. I wrote almost nothing between September of last year and February of this year, but I started regular interviews to begin to bring my vision of Trued Up into fruition, to begin to create again. And it started with the conversation you're about to hear. Michael Alexander is the lawyer who represented my previous guest, Dr. Mark Trozzi. He has also represented and continues to represent many medical professionals wrongly accused, discredited, and dismissed in Canada. He has done so with his inimitable style, made obvious in the conversation you're about to hear. Michael, I discovered, is a Renaissance man. Of course, we spoke about the medical establishment here in Canada and the state of our constitution, but we also spoke of art and philosophy, small-town architecture and big-box utilitarianism. We spoke of his fortitude and passion for justice. Truth, beauty, goodness. On a cool autumn day in mid-October, while exploring how to bring hope and inspiration to others, I discovered how much I needed these things. We all need access to the eternal. The question is, through which portal do you find yours? My hope is that you find some here in the discourse and dialectic of Michael Alexander, my guest today on Trued Up. Okay. So I want to tell you, Michael, that my criteria for inviting people on the podcast is somebody I want to have coffee with. So
I take the compliment.
Good. It is a compliment. It's really the first time I met you. I was interviewing at the Justice for the Vaccinated event, and I was really struck by your commitment, your intelligence, and your unique style. And you have a way of articulating things that's it's not just intelligent, but it's really compelling. Like I felt like you're a natural born storyteller. So there's that. And then you said to me something at an event we were at about the days you went without sleep. And I learned something about you in that moment, about your uniqueness and commitment. So I want to get to that story. But first, can you just give people a sense of what it is that you are currently working on and what you have been working on?
Well, let's talk about the week I really didn't sleep. these cases are so demanding, representing these doctors and other healthcare professionals across the country. I've never worked so hard in my entire life. Part of the reason is that we are under resourced. So a lot of the work, a lot of the scut work, a lot of the admin work ends up on my desk. And sometimes it ends up on my desk at 11 o'clock in the evening. Sometimes we are very tight on a timeline and you start running out of time. I had to make a very important submission in a motion at the College of Physicians in Ontario, and the deadline was looming. And so I had to stay up for 6 days in a row on a total of 7 hours of sleep in order to meet the deadline. Now, I didn't think I was capable of that. And I look back on it and think, I'm lucky I didn't have a heart attack.
Yeah.
But I guess that reflects the passion with which, that I brought to the case, because I was going to make that deadline, whatever it took, because I believe so strongly in their cause.
So let's just go back and talk a little bit about what that cause is.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about what it is you're doing, what you're defending, how you're defending it, why you're defending it, and
Right.
that passion. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we can go straight to COVID-19. I was on board with the public narrative around COVID-19. I took an injection. I have a friend who's a public health officer. He's a really smart guy. I was acting on his recommendations. And I was practice social distancing and all of that. But then I started doing some work with the Justice Center in Calgary, and I gained access to information and to people who had alternative points of view on COVID-19 that previously, I had not encountered. And around that time, I saw a podcast by RFK Jr., in which he was talking about the H1N1 virus and the vaccine that was rolled out for it. And there were around 32 deaths associated with with that vaccine when it was first rolled out. And that led to its complete shutdown. It was withdrawn from the market. I then became aware that at that time, the vaccine adverse events reporting system in the United States, that there were thousands of deaths that had been registered in association with the administration of the vaccine. And so that was very alarming to me. And so I started looking into theirs. And I found a study that had been done by Harvard University and Pilgrim Healthcare back in 2011. And they were trying to figure out how accurate this reporting system is, because all doctors and healthcare personnel are supposed to report adverse events related to vaccines to this system. And they concluded that it captures about 1% of adverse events. So look at those numbers. If you have 7,000 people who have died in association with the COVID-19 injection, then you're talking potentially about 700,000 people. And then you're no longer talking about adverse events, you're talking about a genocide. Now, other estimates have been made regarding the accuracy, and Steve Kirsch has done one. Dr. Jessica Rose has done one. They come out at somewhere between 30 and 40%, but by their own figures, at this point, we are still talking about 1 million people in the U.S. who have probably died in association with the vaccine. So that's when a very, very big shoe dropped for me. And then just one thing led to another. I started talking to doctors. I started representing doctors. I started doing research. And then aspects of the narrative just continued to prove to be false. And so right there, I couldn't put up with that level of deceit.
So what was it? So this is so great. I one of the things that fascinates me is the fact that you were on board in the beginning. I was on board in the beginning. I locked down, I social distanced, right? But you saw things and you heard things and you investigated things and you changed your mind. Now, all that information is out there. It's not hidden. It's public record. It's a lot of it is government record. What is it that you think had you change your mind that where other people aren't or other people aren't looking? What do you think that is?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a lot of things, but I could trace it back to the fact that I'm a student of the Cold War. I was just a little child in the 1960s, but I remember the events of the 1960s very well. My grandfather owned a radio station. So we were constantly watching media, listening to media. And, I lived through the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, and the other terrible events of the 60s. And it became very clear, even to a child and then a teenager, that the government had lied and had covered up essential facts and details around all of these assassinations, but particularly JFK. And now it's almost a matter of record that there was an official government cover up right from the very beginning. And so that has carried through my life. I mean, because those events had such an impact on me, or so indelible in my memory, um, I have always felt very strongly that I needed to know the truth about why these things happened, because actually they were traumatic events for people. So I think that's partly where my passion for the truth and for justice arose. It's partly through my experience of the politics of the 1960s and 70s.
That's really interesting. What do you think it is that has people avoid the truth?
The truth, Solzhenitsyn has a line in the Harvard speech where he says, the truth is almost invariably bitter. And I think that was an overstatement for the purpose of the speech. But we all live with certain illusions. I mean, partly we have to because we're very busy people, particularly in democracy where we all have to make our own way. We don't have time to think everything through. So we live with ideas that influence our behavior, but which perhaps we have not had time to examine properly. And so, yeah.
No, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I think we all live with ideas that perhaps, that in the end may not be true. And when you find that out, it's a disillusioning experience, particularly if you've made some essential life decisions based on those ideas. But the upshot is the exhilaration of knowing the truth, you know. Uh,
Yeah.
but I just to tie that into the 60s, I mean, um, I became very aware through these events that it was important to think critically and that you couldn't always trust the government. And then during the 1970s, it was revealed that the CIA had a mind control program called MK Ultra, and they had been involved in advance in perpetrating, lies and spreading lies and propaganda to influence domestic politics, not just international politics. And so, you have to realize that powerful governments are fully capable. They have a whole machinery that's invested in lying. MK Ultra never went away. It was supposed to after the Senate Select hearings on intelligence during the 70s, but I'm sure the CIA has just continued to develop that. But I'm not just picking on the CIA. We know, of course, of other regimes that do similar things. So, as a result of my experience again of the 60s and 70s, I am not naive about the willingness and the ability of the elites to lie to the people.
Okay, so let's tie that into the CPSO. So, for those who don't know, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, and also other colleges across the country, because I understand that you're representing healthcare practitioners in other places as well.
Mhm.
Okay, so maybe you could just give an overview of what is happening in Canada in terms of the medical community, in terms of the colleges, in terms of the COVID narrative.
Well, I've been an opponent of the college in Ontario since the 2000s, and there is an habitual abuse of power at the college. It was documented back in 1999 by Michael Code, who is now Justice Michael Code, who wrote a report called Medicine Meets Glasnost. It was all about the abuse of power at the CPSO. The government has been on notice for a couple of decades that there are a number of administrative bodies in Ontario that abuse their power, and the minister is not doing his or her job in reining in the people who run these very powerful administrative regulatory bodies. So this is a long-standing problem. So I'm aware of this, and this is not just the case in Ontario; it's the case in other provinces as well, to a greater or lesser degree. British Columbia is particularly bad. So I have, in some sense, been an enemy of what we would call now the administrative state slash deep state, because there are all kinds of decisions that are made behind the scenes every day by bureaucrats and appointed officials that have a profound impact on our lives. And that's really what COVID was all about. It was about the deep state taking over our lives at the expense of elected officials and democracy itself. So, you know, the COVID 19 narrative, um, And the idea that vaccines are safe and effective, that the PCR test is the gold standard, that we had a true pandemic, all of this stuff. You know, the government of Ontario didn't want to enforce that on people. Okay, they don't want. They probably realized that was just going to be a political loser. Try to curb freedom of speech, to impose mandates on the entire population, and so on. So I think what happened is the government said to these healthcare colleges, you know what, we can't do this, but you can do it, and we'll look the other way. And so we have the College of Physicians and many other colleges, as we know, the College of Psychologists in relation to Jordan Peterson. We have these colleges imposing restrictions on what healthcare professionals can say, what they can do, whether they can provide medical exemptions for COVID-19 injections, and so on. So they have these COVID-19 restrictions, which don't have the force of law. They're just policies, but they're being enforced as if they have the force of law.
Well, in some ways, they don't even need the power of the law because people have such trust in medicine. They figure the doctors know, and so they don't even question it.
Right. There is a lot of trust in these institutions, and they're very careful in terms of managing their message to maintain that trust with the public. But they don't deserve that trust, I can tell you. It is, they, I mean, there are particular problems with medicine. So we have in Canada something called the CMPA, the Canadian Medical Protective Association. So doctors pay into this CMPA fund, and then they pay premiums every year, and then they're automatically covered for legal issues, malpractice, and also trouble with the colleges. So doctors already have lawyers representing them vis-a-vis the colleges. However, what the CMPA does not tell doctors is that they will not challenge the colleges on jurisdictional issues. That is, like whether the college is acting within the power given to it under a statute. They also will not challenge on charter issues. So what they do is accept the framework that's given to the doctor by the college when there's a complaint. And they work within that framework. When in fact, if you're really being a lawyer, you should be challenging that framework based on the first principles of law. So we have a problem here, a systemic problem, where lawyers are not doing their job. And it's a matter of policy for them to approach the problem this way. So when some doctors finally figure out that they're being sold out by their own lawyers, I often get the phone call. And I make the arguments that their lawyers are not willing to make.
I think one of the biggest eye openers for me has been how political medicine is. I don't think most people get that. I think how do you make that bridge? Okay, so I have, for example, I have a mother who just stopped wearing a mask about a month ago, and now she's going to put it back on because they're recommending
Right.
it.
Right.
And this is a woman who was an activist, who was quite aware of government corruption and certainly would have questioned pharmaceutical motives, corporate motives in general, and I said, well, you know, they're actually, they don't work and they're not good for you. Oh, and you know better than they do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. So that's a huge problem that just automatically by the officials saying something, people believe it. And I know she believes that she's done her research because she's read the newspaper,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so and listened to the press conference or whatever, right? So how do we break that cycle? I mean, how do we tackle that?
Well, if you tell people the truth, sometimes they won't believe you. In the case of Canada, there were changes made in our healthcare regulations behind the scenes in 2019 to make it possible for the minister to approve medicines, and in particular injections, without doing Health Canada's due diligence. And so that is what happened. There was no due diligence done on the injections, none whatsoever. It was a political decision. And the minister rubber stamped the decision and said, yes, safe and effective. So that is false.
And not
But
only that, but the minister cannot take it back. Unlike if it had gone through Health Canada's normal drug approval process, if there was a certain number of adverse events, he or she would have been able to pull it off the market, and that option is gone.
right. Well, what's interesting about this is that in the summary basis for the decision, which you can get on the Health Canada website for each of these vaccines, you can find you will be told that the minister made his decision based on the Pfizer and Moderna clinical 6-month trials. Okay. That was their data that they used to justify the claim that vaccines are safe and effective. Well, a number of people have taken those trials now and examined the data carefully. And we now know that the data proved the vaccines were never safe and effective, and Pfizer and Moderna knew it. Right? So the minister, at the very least, did not do his due diligence in examining those studies upon which he relied. Right? And he probably very well knew that the studies um, were not exactly legitimate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know. They're about to make billions of dollars, but let's trust them.
Right. Yeah, just trust us.
Yeah.
Um, so that's so you can tell people that they won't always believe you because there's a lot of detail, and it requires a somewhat sophisticated understanding of how government works and so on. But this is where we get into the real problem: is how effective governments have been in their messaging and using propaganda techniques, and in particular using phrases that they've tried to instill in the public mind over and over again. Like, I had a visceral reaction when I started being told that we're all in this together. Okay, so being sort of an individualist, I'm never quite sure we're all in this together. So that one just rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah.
Don't tell me. I'll figure that out for myself. Let me work on that. But I was living in a household at the time with some friends, escaping what I thought was the pandemic in downtown Toronto. I was up north, and they were watching the CBC and CNN. Every night they were being told we're in this together, and then pretty soon every meal I'm being told we're in this together, and every time I get up in the morning we're in this together, and then I I just about went insane. But then the vaccines are safe and effective, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and it goes on. The PCR test is the gold standard. So they choose these phrases very carefully. They seem to know how that they will register with the public mind. I'm sure they've tested it. I'm sure they tested it before they brought it out. And they disseminate it in a way that ensures that it will seep into the public mind. And so that's very insidious. And how to combat that requires a lot of thought. You need your own countermeasures and strategy.
I was just thinking we need to choose some phrases that are just as powerful, and are just as
Right.
simple. But I think you're absolutely right, because first of all, the understanding of how government works, the understanding of medicine, of pharmaceuticals, the fact that, as you said, that we're busy, that people just don't have time to be looking into everything. And I mean, for me, honestly, when I first started writing my blog, I wrote it because I felt absolutely compelled to share this information about the science. Now, I'm an artist. I don't think like a scientist. But for me, because I had years of health issues, I've been following cutting edge health gurus, and science people. And so I had access to this information, and I almost had to force myself to be able to explain it in a way that I could understand it. So I was compelled to share it. But if
Mhm.
I hadn't have gone through that, I mean, I wouldn't have been, really following the science. But I took an online course how to read a study, so that I could have some sense. But I think for a lot of people, their eyes glaze over. They their lives are full. They have far more seemingly immediate concerns.
Mhm.
How do we get through that?
Well, it would help if we had a media that was actually trying to tell the truth. So the job of journalists in this situation is to take those complicated ideas and break them down in a way that the public can understand them. But we have a media in this country that's been bought off by the Trudeau government to the tune of $1 billion. And so media outlets are afraid to criticize the existing government, its COVID policies. Now, on top of that, we have media outlets around the world signing on to these trusted news initiatives. And I found out through Rodney Palmer that there's more than one initiative, that there are at
Yeah.
least three out there. So there have been multiple agreements. And the focus is not on delivering the facts and the real story, but getting people to trust the story, whatever it is. And trust has taken the place of the truth. And he expressed that so well during the NCI hearings. And I think that's really, once you realize that, and you realize how often that word trust is used by government and the media, then you realize that there's something terribly wrong here.
Wow, that's really good. Yeah, I remember that in his testimony, the trust versus truth. But that's something that we could utilize, you know,
Right.
like truth over trust. Like,
Right.
really, is
Yeah,
there
there you
trust,
go. Right.
right?
Truth over trust. That would be a good phrase.
I
Right.
like that. I'm making notes.
Okay.
I
Well,
don't know.
Dr. Robert Malone, as you know, came into town recently and gave a tremendous talk about fifth generation warfare.
Yeah.
So he said, now it's not a battle for land, it's not a battle for money, it's a battle for your mind. And he has explained, I think, extremely well the techniques that are being used by governments and by corporate elites and by big tech to try to control people's minds. Now, he hasn't come up with a set of strategies for combating that. But in my opinion, that is where we need to do a lot of work. First of all, we've got to make people aware of when they are being propagandized and what the techniques are like so that they can identify, oh, this is being rolled out in a certain way. This is a certain kind of phrase. This is a slogan. It's meant to appeal to me in a certain way, but I need to think twice about this. So we need to help people identify when these techniques are being used. So that's more than half the battle. Um, but then on top of that, are there countermeasures? Is there a way in which we can substitute a new language? Now, um, Charles Coves, who's a lawyer and best-selling author based in Australia, has been working on this for quite some time. And when I first got involved in COVID politics, I served on a committee within the legal committee at the World Council for Health, where I was co-chair. And Charles was already right at the very beginning, back in 2021, cataloging the language that was being used and coming up with alternative words and alternative phrases.
Oh, wow.
And so Charles, I think, would be a good person to touch base with to see how far he has gone with that project. And I'm planning to do that in the near future.
Oh, please, please connect me with him because I mean, language is my thing. You
Right,
know?
right, right.
That's I'm fascinated by language, by word choices, and that's it's the best thing about
Mm.
writing for me is finding the right way to communicate in such a way that not only does it hit here, but it hits here. And I
Right.
I think it has to be a head and heart combination. That's what they're doing. That's
Oh,
what
for sure. For
right.
sure. Right. The emotive impact is so important. I mean, I did sort of write a book about this back in the 90s on a similar theme about how to make good decisions. And that sort of the catchphrase that comes out of it is that you have to think what you feel and feel what you think. And that's when you get properly lined up. And if you're communicating with people, you want to try to help them make that connection. I think that's really what you're talking about.
I love that. Can we get that book?
Yeah, it's out of print now. It was a business bestseller for a while. It's
Wow.
called How to Inherit Money.
Okay.
It's all about the North American inheritance boom and what it means for people. But
Okay.
it's ultimately a reflection on all of the contradictions and emotional problems that go along with losing someone and then inheriting something. It doesn't have to be a large amount; it can be a large amount, but there are inherent contradictions in the experience of inheritance. So it's a, sort of an examination of the soul and what we go through in these situations where these contradictions can, bring us down at the very moment we think we're about to succeed.
What compelled you to write about that?
Well, I went through some difficult inheritance experiences myself. I had three family members. In fact, my three uh, surviving immediate family members all died within a year. Uh, well, actually, little closer to a year and a half of each other. And I inherited some very complicated estates. I already had a very complicated life. I was trying to finish off graduate school. I was at a job at a big firm downtown, trying to get my call to the bar. And although I was fairly experienced in dealing with money, I made some mistakes and got into some problems that I could have imagined. So I had to step back at a certain point and say, how did that happen? And then I started reading about inheritance, and there were new statistics out at that time from Cornell, and studying the fact that inheritance was about to become, for the very first time, a middle class phenomenon. And so then I realized, what I just went through, I'm on the leading edge of this. I've got some really good advice for people who are going to be going through this. And so I thought, okay, I see a book in this. And I felt compelled to write it based on my personal experience, which was needlessly difficult because I had advisors, but they almost inevitably gave the wrong advice. The professionals gave personal advice when they should only have been giving professional advice, and friends gave professional advice that they had no business giving, and it was just a mess.
So this, okay, well, so here's a parallel I see. So first of all, you're talking about the head and the heart, and uh, I see that now people were manipulated into making decisions and really a way of being based on having their emotions manipulated.
Hmm.
So using fear to for people to behave in ways that they never would have otherwise behaved. So I see that there that you're dealing. It's interesting that with an inheritance, you're dealing with often a deep emotional loss, and now some kind of material gain, and there's a lot of complexity. So how can we there's something there. There's some parallel there. How can what are the lessons that we can take from that in this situation?
Hmm. Well, just to add a little bit of a wrinkle to that, the big problem that people face is grieving, and a lot of people think that grieving, they don't really understand the grieving process. And most psychologists and psychiatrists say that grieving a significant loss takes at least 12 months. So you're going to go through a whole range of symptoms, some of which can be very vexing. And 20% of survivors get caught in a complicated grief reaction that can go on for years. So
Mhm.
if you're not aware of your grief symptoms and you're not in a position to judge the world and make good decisions. So it's partly becoming aware of this process. And I suppose the parallel here is that we have to be aware of what we've just been put through with fear and how it has influenced our behavior. And then the techniques that have been used to compound the fear and how they traded on the fear to lead us towards the vaccinations and so on and so on, the lockdowns. So it does begin with fear. I must say, in my own case, I mean, I was doing business over in China just before SARS happened in the early 2000s. I came back to Toronto. I mean, SARS was quite a frightening thing. You're reading about people drowning in their own fluids, in hospitals. Right? So that was pretty scary. So they built upon that, for COVID-19. So it was pretty easy to gin up the fear based on that first experience with SARS. But that is the strategy: is first of all to build, a monstrous fear, in the public mind, so that then people feel compelled to act in certain ways. So that's certainly the first big step, and that's where the biggest lie was told. Because in 2021 and 2022, the CDC itself, which was promoting the COVID narrative, nonetheless published statistics that established that there were more injuries, severe illnesses, and deaths resulting from the annual flu than from COVID.
Yeah,
So that's a
yeah,
pretty heavy fact that has just pretty well been ignored.
yeah. It is. It is fascinating how that just was passed over, and all of a sudden we're dealing with the greatest threat ever we've ever faced.
Right, right. And you get enough people saying it. I mean, there were an alliance of forces. You have the government saying it, you have elected officials, you have the media, you have big tech censoring people if they're not saying the right things. I mean, it was a coordinated effort. I'm not suggesting there was a conspiracy from the very beginning, but everybody had an interest on getting on board with this because various people got more power out of it or more money. There are lots of goodies there for people if they participated in this narrative at the elite level.
Mhm.
So it was, I don't know whether it was planned, that they knew people would glom on in that way, but it was certainly effective.
Yeah, it certainly was.
The one
Um,
thing that was effective.
yeah, yes, no kidding. So I want to go back to the doctors. Now you have, what is the status? Can you give us like an update? I'm trying to include those who don't really know what's been happening with the doctors, how they've been attacked, why they've been attacked, or targeted, however you want to put it, and where things are now, what you've been doing and where things are now.
Okay. So primarily, the doctors I've been defending have been singled out because they may have written some medical exemptions for COVID-19 injections. Um, and when the colleges were telling them not to do it, they may have prescribed ivermectin, which throughout the so-called pandemic was a Health Canada approved medication and eligible to be prescribed by any doctor in the country. Nonetheless, the colleges said you were doing something unlawful if you prescribed it. So I have some doctors who are facing that. And then we have doctors who just said critical things about the colleges, about governments, about big pharma. They're calling into question the COVID-19 narrative. And that's where the harshest punishment has been meted out.
For those who
So,
are questioning the narrative.
yeah, for those who are exercising their fundamental human right to freedom of expression.
Is there any precedent for a time when doctors were, I don't know, doing their job and being punished for that?
Not in my lifetime. Not in my lifetime. This is a fundamental attack on the doctor-patient relationship and the idea of informed consent,
Mm-hmm.
which is based on the principle that you can have a completely confidential conversation with your doctor, who can provide you health information about treatments, medications, and so on, in accordance with his or her own understanding and conscience. And you then ultimately have the right. Now, there's certain things the doctor must tell you: risks and benefits of medication, for instance, alternatives to medication or treatment. There's a whole list of things they must go through. But as long as they're meeting that list and speaking honestly based on their expertise, that relationship should not be disturbed. But the college has stepped in and said, no, we are going to regulate informed consent now. Now, informed consent is guaranteed under the Canadian Charter in relation to Section 7, which guarantees life, liberty, and security of the person. So, this is a fundamental assault on a principle in medicine that we've taken for granted for decades. And it's a violation of Section 7 of the Charter. So this is, I'm fighting for the Charter in this situation, not only for freedom of expression, but for informed consent, everything that goes along with it, which is the ability to write medical exemptions and also the right to prescribe medications that have already been approved by Health Canada.
You know, there were several lawyers who testified with the NCI who basically said, "Well, the charter lasted 40 years and it's done." What are your thoughts on that? Do we have a charter that works for the people?
We don't have the rule of law of this country, or we haven't had a charter for a long time. There's a case in 1987. It's called Regina and Oaks. It established the basic test that's used to determine whether a charter right has been infringed and whether, at the end of the day, the government should have the right to infringe it. Okay, so you have a like. Let's just take freedom of expression. So the government might pass some measure that limits your freedom of expression. So you have to establish, first of all, that it in fact does that. And there are a series of tests. But then the government can come back under Section 1 of the Charter and say, well, we've infringed the right, but it's a reasonable limit on the right in a free and democratic society. Okay. So then they have to present evidence that they are advancing the greater good by limiting the right. Okay. Now, the whole charter turns on how much evidence you have to show. Now, originally, the government had a high evidentiary burden. So you had to come in and show, based on this Regina and Oaks case, which again goes back to 1987, the government had to come with cogent and persuasive evidence. So that's quite a high evidentiary burden. And that does justice to the idea that our individual rights come first before government. That's the whole purpose of the charter, is to recognize our human rights, right, which stand out over and against the government and its laws and legislation and regulations. So the only way to do justice to that is to put a very, very high burden on the government to prove its case. So cogent persuasive, I think, did the job. But thereafter, the court began to water down cogent persuasive. And now the standard, and it has been for at least 25 years, the balance of probabilities. Now, this is a civil law standard that's used in tort cases, contract cases, things like that. It's a simple idea. All you have to do is show more probably than not. In this case, the government has to show more probably than not that it is advancing the greater good by infringing the right. You just need now some evidence. You just need to have, in effect, 51% of the evidence on your side as compared to 49% for the citizen in order to make your case as the government. So, in effect, now, under the Section 1 test, the government and the individual face off on an equal plane, on an equal footing. And so, government almost always wins. Whereas before, the government, it was the individual was up here, the government was down here, and had this very high evidentiary burden to meet to justify infringing the individual's rights. So, it's really the Supreme Court of Canada has sold out the charter over the last 25 years, and now we are reaping the whirlwind, if that's the right phrase.
It's absolutely stunning that I think most Canadians walk around thinking we live in a free and democratic society, and yet, I mean, I agree. I guess it's one of the benefits of the last 3 years is that it really has shined a light on the fact that that charter, that's not protecting us.
It's very disappointing. I mean, one of the reasons I went into law was because of the charter. You know, and I was a student of American government, and I love the Bill of Rights and the idea of guaranteed rights. I studied the political philosophy of rights as a graduate student in both political science and law. I can give you all the arguments for them. And the idea that we were going to have a Charter of Rights in Canada was a thrilling idea to me. And so it's with great disappointment that I've seen our constitutional law go in this direction. And the depth of the problem has really become clear to me during COVID. Now, I've been trying to restore the older understanding of charter rights, and there are some ways to do it. There are some cases that you can use and some principles you can use. So in the case of freedom of expression, I think it's quite clear that the court has said that government may not censor minority opinions simply because they are minority opinions, unless those opinions fall into certain prohibited categories. And there are only three. One is if your speech may cause immediate physical harm to another person. In other words, you incite a riot by saying something inflammatory in the wrong situation. Don't yell fire in a crowded theater. Then the two other exceptions are hate speech and pornography.
Right.
Okay. So you can't say that anything that my doctors have said fall into any of those three prohibited categories. So I still think that there is case law on the books to vindicate the idea that we have an absolute right to express minority opinions in this country. And I just argued that case before the College of Physicians and Surgeons in July. And we just had a decision in the Trozzi case last week. And they reduced my 51-page factum and these arguments about freedom of expression to one line, in which they just kind of dismissed my whole point of view. So they didn't even grapple with the constitutional law and the principles of legal theory that I put in front of them. They just ignored it.
You said in a past interview the colleges are the leading arm of this soft totalitarianism.
Right.
How do all of us go up against that? How do we reform, fix, recreate? What do we do?
Well, political action would solve the problem. I mean, if I could get a minister of, if I could run for government, become Minister of Justice or Minister of Health, I'd introduce 2 pages of amendments to the Regulated Health Professions Act in Ontario, and these problems would be over forever. If we had somebody at Queen's Park who was willing to listen to people who have substantive criticism about the legislation. Many of these problems have occurred because the bureaucrats at the colleges get too much leeway, and they abuse their power as a result in these gray zones the legislation is given. I mean, if the minister would just do her job in Ontario, she could make one phone call to the college and say, you've gone too far, and it would be over. So that's one way. Another way, in the case of doctors, for instance, is to mobilize doctors. I mean, one third of the doctors in this province walked out and said, we're not working anymore. We're not paying our fees to the college. We will take care of people who are in dire circumstances, but otherwise, we're not on the job anymore. Deal with it.
You
It
know,
would be over.
yeah, there was a doctor, actually, I think he was a dentist in the NCI who testified, who said that it should have been the Mercedes and Escalades in Ottawa.
Right. And you know what? It's unfortunate, but the people in the Mercedes and Escalades don't want to lose their Mercedes and Escalades.
So this is something I wanted to talk about. I personally do not understand how someone puts their own personal comforts above what is right, particularly when it comes to not some like moral ambiguity, but people dying. I don't even know where to start with that. How do people do that? How do people live with themselves like that? How do we crack that open?
Right. Well, Julian Assange, who I really don't know that much about, said something recently that I think made sense. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that courage is more scarce than intelligence.
Oh, it's
And we have a
so
lot of very smart people who don't have the courage to stand up. But I think it starts with medical education. I also think it starts with legal education when it comes to lawyers, because the vast majority of the lawyers will not stand up to this thing either. They're too concerned about creating a bad reputation for their firm, alienating clients, or whatever it may be. Um, a lot of doctors have come to me and said, when we're in medical school, they tell us, whatever you do, don't make trouble with the college. So, I mean, it's instilled in them in the very beginning. The college is the authority. You don't want trouble. They could take away your license. So you just bow down when they come to see you and say you've done something wrong. And that's what the vast majority of people do. What we need to do is teach doctors that we have a constitution. We need to teach them about the fundamentals of informed consent. We need to make them aware of the Healthcare Consent Act in Ontario and what it really means. I mean, if we were to educate our professionals to understand the legal and cultural context within which they should be operating, then we would have a different kind of society. But I would say right now, professional education has been a drastic failure.
uh, I this whole idea of courage. I mean, this has been one of the more than corruption, because I mean, I certainly knew that there was some corruption in government. Certainly knew that there was some corruption in the pharmaceutical industry, but the lack of integrity in most people has been the biggest shock and disappointment for me. That people don't live in in alignment with their own beliefs, with their own values. This lack of courage, and clearly in our education system, we need to elevate courage. We need to elevate integrity. Like there doesn't seem to be any emphasis. So, is it the education system? What do you think is the reason for this lack of courage?
Well, I
And
think yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think there's a failure in our educational system too, in terms of civics. We're not teaching the first principles of what it means to live in a liberal democratic country. They do a much better job of that in the U.S. I mean, civics education has been corrupted down there by the EDI agenda. But most Americans know the First Amendment. If you try to, it doesn't matter where you are. You could be in the middle of the Ozarks. You try to shut somebody down, they'll start screaming First Amendment. Right? We don't have something. So people up here don't say, "You can't tell me, to shut up." What about Section 2B of the Charter? We just don't have something equivalent.
It's been
And
amazing. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
yeah, yeah. So I think that one lawyer made a comment about this, that it is a failure of civic education. That's why the charter is failing in part, and I think that's true.
I think that it was interesting to you talk about civics lessons. I mean, I knew nothing about I knew nothing about this, and in fact, when I heard Bruce Party's testimony at the NCI, I wrote about it. I said, "This is like the best civics lesson I've ever had." Just a basic understanding of how our government actually works.
Yes.
Um, so I want to ask you now. I want to find this. Hold on. I read that you had defended yourself
in the Supreme Court and
Right.
that you said, I had the greatest day of my life. I was energized in the way I used to be before a big game when I was a starting guard for my high school basketball team.
I forgotten I said that.
So I love that. But clearly, you have natural courage or confidence or a combination. Where does that come from?
That's a good question. Uh, you know, well, I think it partly comes from just who I am. I did Jordan Peterson's personality profile recently. Did his
Yeah.
personality test, and I rate very high in openness to experience and ideas, which puts me high in creativity. So that's nice and everything, but it also means that I'm the kind of person who is not always willing to accept authority, and I'm willing to challenge authority. So for whatever reason, I'm that personality type. I'm skeptical of what the authorities are telling us and willing to question them. I suppose I've always been that way. How did I get that way? I mean, my grandfather was quite an extraordinary person, and he had a tremendous impact on my life. He was the radio station owner. He was an extremely inventive, creative person, ironic, did things by indirection, stimulated my imagination. So he was just inducted into the Chatham Kent, where I'm from the municipality of Chatham, the Chatham Kent Hall of Fame, because he built and owned one of the first privately owned radio stations in the country. He had a number of technological firsts in the radio industry. He had the first government approved radio station, the first station to reduce signal variance to zero. I could go on and on and on. He was a major player in the industry for close to 40 years. So, and his radio station is still around, and now it's a group of stations. So I was talking about what it was like when I accepted the award on his behalf, what it was like to be his grandson. And my grandfather had a huge playroom in his basement that ran the length of his home. And there were what I would call creativity stations there. There was an elaborate trained set, movie making equipment, games of chance, including billiards, a shooting range, the most powerful ham radio station set in the country, uh, steam engines to illustrate how steam power work. It goes on and on and on. And the principle of Jack's Playroom was if you wanted something and it doesn't exist, you did a drawing, you did a design, you put it on the bulletin board, and then you made it or you had somebody make it for you. My grandfather made his way in the world by challenging conventions and by doing things people had never done before. And he instilled that in me through play, and that has always stuck with me. So I think if you were to look back on how this all started, it started with my grandfather, who had an ability to create things ex nihilo. It did not accept things as they were.
Wow. Wow. I love that whole, first of all, I love the idea of basically becoming a creative and critical thinker through play, which is the best
Right,
way to do it, right?
right,
Because
right.
then you're actually inspired and engaged, and it's not just something you have to do. So that's amazing. But also the notion of if you want something, invent it or have someone invent it. I think that's something that we could really use right now. So how do we, I think, so what I'm hearing is, first of all, we need to have people really see what we actually have. That's the first thing, right? Is to have people see what we have, and then to have them understand that we need to invent something, and then to go do something about that and get creative about how we do that.
Yeah, and I think that's where you and an artist are in a perfect position to play a role because we need humorists, we need artists, we need creative people, we need critical thinkers. We don't need lawyers who are bound by rules and regulations and all kinds of conservative strategy conventions. I mean, given the way I was raised, it's a little surprising I went into law, and that's a whole other story. We don't need to get into that. But I'm always railing against the law in some ways. But that's because I try to bring some critical thinking and creativity to it, and that's where I gain my competitive advantage as a lawyer. But that's what we need. We need to draw on the right brain, so to speak. We need to draw on an aspect of ourselves that's not purely rational, but what gives us access to things that will allow us to fight this battle. So this is a call to action, but in a certain way.
It's great what you're saying, because I also hear another failure of the education system, right? When you start taking out arts and drama, and you take out all those right brain activities, you lose this huge capacity to invent, to create, to do something other than the status quo.
And this goes back to my book, How to Inherit Money, and feeling what you think and thinking what you feel. Because one of the reasons I got into trouble uh, in this very difficult life situation I was in was that I'd lost touch with my intuition and everything that goes with it. And when I made bad decisions, I realized in retrospect I was thinking one thing and feeling another. I wasn't listening to my gut. And so, I make a lot of decisions now based on gut instinct. There is a process I go through. But to think that there is a purely rational solution to this problem would be false. I don't think most of the solutions in life are purely rational. And we need to draw on our intuitive selves and other aspects of the self in order to come up with meaningful ideas and creative solutions. And so that sounds a little vague, but I think I try to get that across in my speeches and other things that I do.
For me, it sounds delicious. That's exactly the kind of thing I like to chew on. Are you willing to share your process?
Yeah, in law, um, I don't start from the law anymore. I'm not sure I
You don't
ever did.
start from, sorry, I
I
missed.
don't start with the law. As a lawyer, I never start with the law. I start with the perception that there is a moral problem or there's an injustice here, and it needs to be remedied. And my sense of justice is partly based on my study of law. It's partly based on my study of political philosophy. It's partly based on my life experience. It's everything I am. But I see something and I say, no, I think that's wrong. What can I do about it? And so I then begin to think about various solutions. Some might be legal, some might be uh, you know, political, it might be social, it depends. It might be something very individual, just talking to somebody. So I think about those different solutions. And then if I have to tackle that problem as a lawyer, then I look at the law with those solutions in mind. So then I say, okay, are there legal principles that will vindicate um, the client in this situation, that will remedy this injustice? And I read the law that way. Right? Now, sometimes the law comes up short, and sometimes it turns out to be more generous than you could imagine. But I do my legal research with a view to a solution I already have or solutions I already have in my mind. So that way, I am not, as many lawyers are, just simply saying, well, that's what the court said last week, and so that's the way we've got to do it. Sometimes you have to say that, but in my own analysis, I never start there. What the court said last week may be profoundly wrong.
I, it sounds to me that you're actually practicing the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. I mean, not that you're not practicing the letter of the law, but that your focus and your intention is on the spirit of it, which really
Yeah,
should be to serve people.
right. Yeah, thank you for saying that. There's a book I studied as a graduate student by Montesquieu called The Spirit of the Laws. And so that is kind of the approach that I take. I mean, I measure the law against the higher principles of justice, which I've studied, which are disclosed by philosophy, political philosophy. I mean, this whole idea of liberal democracy, it all emerged out of a certain way of thinking. And there are certain philosophers who gave us these ideas, which eventually permeated um, our lives, and that's why we have the Western world. We have Western democracies. So go back to John Locke, go back to Immanuel Kant, go back to Montesquieu, the framers of the American Constitution, who were great students of John Locke. And if you read these writers, then you do put yourself in touch with the spirit of the law, and like even the metaphysical principles that they use, the principles of knowledge they use to come up with the idea of human rights. So it gets pretty heavy, but I spent a lot of time. I wrote my thesis at Columbia on, Kant's legal philosophy. So I do approach law that way. I approach it from the standpoint of first principles and the spirit of the legal system, and I work my way down. This is also combined with other things. At this point, my knowledge of the law, personal experience, and so on. But yeah,
I also, just I know this is the water you swim in, but the distinction between justice and law, I think right there is very powerful. I,
right,
I think
right,
people, yeah, just assume that they're the same, but they're not.
right. And there are schools of thought, and they teach us in law school. The school of thought is called positivism. As long as you're following the proper procedures that were laid down by the Constitution, and you get a law resulting from it, you followed all the rules, and you get a rule. That's justice. I've never believed that's justice. In fact, if you believe that's justice, you should find yourself another profession. Because if that's all our legal system is, then there are better ways to make a living. There are better ways to make money. Uh, it's a very bankrupt notion but it's nonetheless uh, the dominant way of looking at the legal system.
You said if you look at something, you think, I think that's wrong. What can I do about it? So I think most people think, I think that's wrong. I'm going to go watch TV. So, or I'm going to go drink, you know?
Sometimes I do, but
Hey, listen, we all have to indulge in something
right,
once
right,
in a while. We all need to
right.
escape. But how do we move people from that to what can I do about it?
Hmm. Well, that's kind of a matter of civic education too, because if you're a patriot, if you believe in your country, you won't want to put up with injustices being inflicted on your fellow citizens. I think there's something. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but one writer I studied as a graduate student was Rousseau, and Rousseau favored. He was on in favor of what appeared to be the large emerging commercial state, and he thought it would corrupt people, and it would corrupt people's souls, and people would become so self-interested they wouldn't care about each other anymore, and society would become quite a miserable place, a kind of war of all against all, where each person is trying to take advantage of the other, nobody can be trusted, and so on. And to some extent, he was right. But I think he overstated the case. But he was in favor of smaller communities where people could know each other and care about each other. And I think there is a certain reality to that. I do come from Chatham, Ontario. When I grew up there, the population was about 36,000 people. It had its limits, but I knew my community, and in some ways, I cared about my neighbor. And we're moving now to a version of society based on strip malls. When I went north of the city to hide from the pandemic, I was living just above Newmarket. Go into Newmarket. It's just one great mall after another, connected by large thoroughfares. There's no way for people to connect with each other. I only saw one church the whole time I was there. The original downtown area has not been preserved. We just have people collected together based on convenience. So it only takes 10 minutes to get to Walmart. I can get my stuff. I run into a few people. I go home. That's my life. That's a very depressing view of life. And what I was struck by, I never shopped in Costco or Walmart before because I was lived in the middle of a major city, like
Mm-hmm.
Toronto, New York, Chicago. So when I went up there, though, I went and I was really, really struck by something, which is how depressed people are in those stores. Like it was palpable to me. I was shocked by it, particularly in Costco. I mean, uh, people who are shopping, they're brushing up against each other, but nobody says anything to anybody else. There's no human connection there. People are completely within themselves, yet they're somehow in this big group collective environment. It's a tremendous paradox. But I found this also in the Bay. I found this in Walmart. I've never seen so many unhappy people as the people at the cash desk in the cash desks in the Bay. Yeah, and so I think this whole way of organizing people is very wrong. I think it will lead us away from the just society. Because if this is how we have contact with people on a daily basis without other mediating institutions and a sense of architecture that brings us together, and buildings that express our civic spirit and give us an identity, which is what our small towns used to do, and even our larger cities used to do.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Now we're organizing people in a different way, strictly on the level of convenience. And I think that way of organizing society is going to lead to a complete breakdown of civic morality and of justice, because people will not care anymore about what happens to their neighbor. In fact, every time you go to the mall, you'll be encountering a different neighbor.
This is so powerful, and I completely get it because I grew up in downtown Toronto.
Uh-huh.
And I remember the first time, so I was working for a television show and I was going out to the suburbs to shoot home decorating in people's homes, in our viewers' homes. And the first time I went to a subdivision, I barely felt like I could breathe. Like it was so bizarre to me that this thing had been plunked into the middle of some land. There were no trees, and people had no books.
Right.
People had no books in their houses. That freaked me out, truly. Well, because the first thing I do is look at someone's bookshelf, right? What do they read? What interests them? What artwork do they have on the walls? They didn't
Right.
have artwork. They had pieces that matched the couch, you know? Like
Right.
there's this anesthetizing, this sanitizing, this like complete lack of focus. Again, you know, there's that creativity, that development of that side of ourselves, that self-expression.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Well, I think that the big box stores also hurt us that way.
yeah,
You can go into Walmart, as I did, looking for a wall clock, and there are like 25, maybe 30 different wall clocks there, and they all have a different design, but they're equally junk. I mean, there is nothing to aspire to within these stores. They don't even present you with products. It used to be, in the old Eatons, as you went higher up, there were more expensive things, more refined things.
yeah,
You wanted fine furniture, you went to the top floor, right? And there was kind of, in a strange way, a kind of it encouraged aspirations to succeed and get to the next level and experience something more beautiful, more refined, more sophisticated. That's gone now. In these stores, there's nothing refined, sophisticated, nothing that inspires the human spirit. Everything is just made with the same low quality. And they try to distinguish everything based on design, and the design's not very good. So I think this can't but crush the human spirit in some way.
wow, you just so validated so much for me. Um, you said the other thing was organizing around convenience. I think this is so fundamental because even with things like the implementation of digital currency, the fact that people are so easily being moved away from cash because it's just so convenient. I make a point of paying cash, and I have a little piece of paper that says why I paid cash. And when there's a lineup at the grocery store and I won't go to the self checkout, I tell the checkout person, I'm saving your job. That's why I'm doing this. That is going to take away your job.
Yeah.
But the whole convenience thing. So, and I think that ties into the big box stores because I get it. I go to Costco. It's convenient. And there are things I do to counter that, but there are things like it's a constant tweaking of where what has the best impact overall. Um, but how do we counter that desire for convenience? It's a convenience has become a value.
Right. And in fact, this is what we would call utilitarian thinking, that
Yeah.
everything has to be done by cost benefit analysis. And it's no mistake that the people who've been running this COVID enterprise are people who have business degrees and MBAs where they teach cost benefit analysis and systems of management and control. Okay. When your elites are educated in this way, then you get a society that only thinks in terms of convenience, does not think in terms of uh, morality, justice, aesthetics as things that come before convenience and that are more important than convenience, and which can't be even measured in any way by convenience.
And I see how what you're saying, that the whole big box store thing has dulled people's senses and even desires, their aspiration for beauty.
Yes, and I think there's a sinister purpose. It may not have been the original purpose, but my perception of this is that these, particularly Costco and Walmart, are there to get people habituated to a lower middle class standard of living. So if you're not making a lot of money, you can afford to go there and buy in bulk, whether it's toilet paper or whatever it is, right? And this prepares us for the new society where you will own nothing and be happy. So
Okay.
you'll make just enough to be able to buy, 2 months supply of toothpaste at Costco. But and so we'll prevent you won't rebel because at least you can get the essentials at an affordable price. But while you're there shopping, we're going to take everything else you have. I think it's I think it's deeply insidious.
How do we counter that?
Uh, these are so many problems at once.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, uh, there are individual things I do, like for instance, in Chatham, I have fought for the preservation of historic buildings that represent the civic spirit and give us pride in our city, and allow us to contemplate something that's beautiful when we go downtown. So it can be something as simple as architectural preservation, or it could be as simple as saying, I'm not going to shop at the mall. I'm going to shop at these other stores to the extent that they still exist. Um, but I suppose it's really up to each person. The question is how to develop the awareness with people, but to bring beauty and to cultivate other interests in your own life, however you may do it. It might be studying the piano, it might be taking art lessons, it might be whatever. But I think particularly in this world that's emerging, and I feel this need very strongly myself, is the need to experience something higher. Because at the end of the day, I've been down slugging it out with some pretty awful and nasty people, and it's very hard to get that out of your system. So I have to find a way to elevate myself and connect with positive energy or put some positive energy into the world. But in terms of a mass solution, I'm not sure there is a mass solution. I haven't thought about it in those terms. But I do think the way in which we plan our cities needs to be fundamentally changed.
Oh,
And that is something that we could work on. I don't know if it's still true in Japan today, but at one time, they had essentially outlawed malls so they could keep their unique neighborhoods. And as I say, I don't know if that's still the case, but I think that was a pretty good idea.
that's a tremendous idea. I don't know how we do it here. I am not a mall fan myself. I avoid them. That's one thing I definitely do.
Well, I'm not sure. By the way, I'm not sure there is any turning back. I mean, the solution might have to be something highly original and different. But I live 2 blocks from the Eaton Center. I mean, I'm not against malls as such.
The Eaton Center, though, I mean, at least it was pre-strip mall. I grew up going to the Eaton Center because I grew up not far from where you are, and would walk to the Eaton Center. And, I mean, it was actually beautiful.
Right,
You know,
right.
the glass domed ceiling and the geese and the first time was like, wow, this is really something. It's not anything like the malls we see now, the suburban malls, which are
Yeah,
so inhumane.
absolutely, absolutely. It's just cement.
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah. God, this is depressing, Michael. This is meant to be uplifting. Like,
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I uh, I do. I mean, the reason I fight the cases is because, in spite of what the courts have done with our constitutional law and to some extent with our administrative law, there are still principles within those bodies of law that have not been completely delegitimized, and it still may be possible to restore, um, a more robust understanding of our legal rights and duties and our human rights and duties. So the day that it becomes clear that that project has failed is the day I quit.
I want to ask you, well, there's two things. One thing is I see that, looking at from the other side, because we can just go, wow, everything sucks, and we'll
Right,
just keep fighting. But I
right,
don't believe in fighting. I believe in creating. And I believe that's what you're doing.
by coming from a different paradigm, by coming from this truth and justice and creativity, that you are utilizing an existing system, but you're doing it in a creative way. And I think that the opportunity of this moment in time, of this moment in history, is to rise up into our greatest selves, to express beauty, to do the thing that you feel compelled to do, to bypass that fear, that concern about personal possessions or what people think, whatever it is that gets in your way, and put that aside and really live the life you're here to live. How is it we get people to stand up and do that, even if they don't specifically fight the law, but how do we get them to live in accordance with that?
Hmm. That's really tough. There's no question that at this time there is a call to creativity and spirituality to transcend all of this. Um, and uh, as I say, I mean, I'm kind of like Robert Malone. I can diagnose the problem right now. There are certain ways in which I push out on it, but as for a global solution, I'm not sure what that looks like. Whether we have to move beyond liberal democracy, we certainly have to move beyond utilitarianism. But I think most of all, we have to move away from what the globalists are trying to impose upon us, which is technocratic tyranny, which is, they don't think of it as tyranny, of course. They think of it as the highest stage of social and political development, but that our lives will be ruled by corporate and government bureaucrats, and that democracy will become inconsequential. In fact, I just saw a video the other day where Klaus Schwab is saying that AI has come along so quickly that we are soon going to be able to get into what he something calls prescriptive measures. So, in other words, we can use technology to determine what people want before they want it, and so we can just, he said, essentially said, in so many words, we can dispense with elections and won't be necessary anymore. If that isn't a scary vision of the future, I don't know what is. So the first thing I would say is, people have got to become aware of what's going on here. The globalists want to replace the democracy. They consider it to be an inferior regime. And so people have to be aware, first of all, what's going on. They could lose their precious rights and freedoms very quickly, and they already have, right? Some of them. And then you have to be prepared to say no. You have to be prepared to say no when you vote. You have to be prepared to say no when you read something in the paper or you see something on video to that effect. You have to be prepared to say no when you're at the Rotary Club and somebody espouses this point of view, and you say, "No, I don't agree with that," and we're going to have we're going to have to duke this out here. Right? So people have to take a stand, I think, every day in their lives to the extent it's possible. But there's also another side to this, which is that you have to survive. I have to face that myself. I mean, I've been taking huge risks fighting these COVID cases, but if I take so many risks I can't make a living and I can't survive to fight another day, then I haven't done my job. So I think all of us have to figure out, within this new world they're trying to bring upon us, how do I survive? Where is my place in the world? How can I make a living? And then if I can figure that out, then where can I take a stand to make a difference?
Those are great questions that people can ask themselves, and I think that, in combination with finding some way to live in community, even if it's in a big city, to find your tribe in whatever area that is, and to recreate that small town community atmosphere, right? So that you do feel like you belong, that you do have a sense that people are taking care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think it is. There are different ways. Like I'm fighting some issues now in municipalities, in Pickering and Chatham-Kent. We have something in our province now called integrity commissioners, and every municipality must have a code of conduct. And these integrity commissioners can come in, they can conduct secret investigations where they don't reveal the facts of complaints that have made against council members, and then they can make a decision to sanction the council members by suspending pay for up to 3 months. So we've now brought grand inquisitors, like official state censors, into our civic government. So if you want to know how to make a difference after you've made your money for the day, take a stand, with your local city council against this kind of censorship. So there are different ways to do it within your community. You will confront these problems at all levels. And so the point is, when you realize that you're up against it, is to take your stand. And people in Chatham are taking a stand, and people in Pickering are taking a stand. So I stand with them.
Thank you for taking a stand. Thank you for being an example. I think what people need to realize at this time is that taking a stand, it isn't just the right thing to do, but it's actually the most empowering thing we can do. That when we take a stand, we actually experience our own agency. And this is the opportunity of this moment.
Yes, experiencing your own agency is a good thing. And when you take your stand, you feel better.
Yeah.
You feel better for expressing what you believe in.
I'm so grateful to you for this time, this conversation, for who you are, for your fight for the doctors. I have met some of these doctors. They are people of integrity. They are people of ethics. And if people understood the way they are being persecuted and forced out of the medical profession, I think people would be absolutely gobsmacked. And you are right there doing what needs to be done, fighting the fight for them and for all of us. And I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's been a great opportunity for a wide-ranging conversation about the things that really matter.
Well, I hope we'll do it again.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Take care, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is how you get trued up. I left my conversation with Michael in a state of inspired receptivity. When I went back to listen to it nearly 6 months later, I had the same experience. Conversations, I was reminded, are an act of creation. They form the foundation of our life experience. They lay the groundwork for anything and everything we want or don't want to build, from healthy relationships to a new world order. In the beginning was the Word. When the government and media want to control us, they start with conversation. The greater good, safe and effective, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Most people didn't even know what that curve was, but we compliantly locked ourselves down. Michael reminded me that we need not only to counter the false narrative, but to invent a true one, a compelling alternative. Truth over trust, facts over fear. They locked us down, let's lock them up. Just a thought. My next takeaway, among so many, is that when we have nothing truly beautiful to aspire to, the human spirit is crushed. What is our experience of life when it becomes simply about efficiency? To live lives we love, we must have an inspiring context, something that fuels us when the tasks before us become challenging. It reminds me of the story of the two bricklayers. One lived a life of drudgery, meaninglessly laying brick after brick all day long. The other lived a life of joy, present to his purpose to build a cathedral. Finally, there is Michael's observation that every aspect of how we organize society gives us or takes away our identity, our morality, and our experience of life. It all matters. Our thoughts and words and actions matter, which means we have the power to organize ourselves in a way that supports our experience of life. And we have the responsibility, the opportunity. If we allow others to determine the direction of our society, we get what we tolerate. Now is the time for engagement, for creation, for community. Truth, beauty, goodness. In Michael Alexander's relentless pursuit of justice, I found a man standing up for what is right using his unique talents, tools, and training. We can all use our unique talents, tools, and training. And we can join the Switch Away initiative and shop for a better world. A world where companies with values, principles, and non-toxic products replace utilitarian chains selling us poison. If you want to find out more, just email me at michelle@gatheryourwits.com. There's so much more I could say about this rich and diverse discussion, but I'd like to know about your takeaways. Please let me know in the comments section. And stay tuned. Be true to yourself, and remember that we are the ones we've been waiting for.